Hi there, this is Gaëtan from The Flares. This podcast is usually in French, but we occasionally invite English-speaking guests. This is the case for this episode. Today, I have the pleasure to talk with Joe Carlsmith, writer, researcher, and philosopher. He works as a senior research analyst at Open Philanthropy, where he focuses on existential risk from advanced artificial intelligence, the topic of this episode. This conversation is available on YouTube with French subtitles or in audio only on Spotify and other platforms to listen to podcasts. You can like, comment, and subscribe to support this podcast. Thank you, and let's go.
L'Internet des objets. L'intelligence artificielle vous intéresse ? Accédez aux derniers livres audio, podcasts et livres électroniques en un seul endroit. Trouvez votre source d'inspiration sur farnell.com/multimédia. Farnell, votre fournisseur de produits électroniques et industriels.
Bienvenue sur le
podcast de
So thank you, Joe, for accepting to talk to me about artificial intelligence and your report. But first, could you introduce yourself, your work and background, and how did you first become interested in studying the existential risk of artificial intelligence?
Sure. So I work at Open Philanthropy, which is a foundation that makes grants partly to reduce the risk of kind of catastrophe from artificial intelligence and other catastrophes as well. And then I have a background in philosophy. I have a doctorate in philosophy, and I kind of write independently about philosophy and futurism and other things on the side.
Okay. Yeah. So because you have a background in philosophy, maybe I'm tempted to ask if you're a moral realist or anti-realist, and which branch of ethics do you feel more connected with?
Yeah. So I think the most interesting and substantive question in meta-ethics, the sort of the moral realism, moral anti-realism question, is whether moral facts are in some sense irreducibly over and above facts about the natural world. So this is a form of moral realism that's associated with philosophers like Derek Parfit, Thomas Nagel, David Enoch, and others. And it was a form that I was interested in kind of early on in graduate school and kind of late in undergrad. I have come to think that view is wrong, or at least very unlikely to be true. I think there's some possibility that we're confused about how to think about this in some way that makes it true. But I'm pretty skeptical. And then once you're skeptical of that, I think it's less clear to me what is at stake in some of these meta-ethical questions. For example, what's at stake in the difference between what's sometimes thought of as naturalist realism versus anti-realism about morality. It seems to me mostly once you settle the question of sort of what there is, what the world, what sort of the broad domain of facts is, and if that domain is centrally sort of natural, it's less clear to me at least what's at stake in some of the other debates. So that's the meta-ethical piece. And then in terms of kind of utilitarianism, deontology, stuff like that, I think I don't identify as a utilitarian. I do feel some broad kinship with a kind of strain of ethical thinking that thinks that at some level, at least, what is ultimately at stake in choice and action is your creation of the world, or your kind of moving the world. What ultimately results when you act is like a way things are. And that can include, now I think that can include a lot of features of the way things are that aren't always associated with a kind of consequentialist calculus. But there's some way in which, for me, it's sort of the bedrock is like the actual world and how it goes. And then there's some related ideas that I sort of feel sympathetic to in a consequentialist vein, to the effect that sort of the considerations that bear on our actions should sort of matter to the people who they are in some sense about. And I see many forms of deontology as sort of fixating on forms of kind of causal structure and other features of our action that don't seem to me suitably grounded in the interests of the people at stake, at least at a kind of theoretical level. And then I think there's a different question of like, when we talk about deontology and consequentialism and other stuff like that, at what level of abstraction are we meaning to kind of pitch the debate? In particular, I think in practice, a lot of consequentialist thinking and kind of, can actually be quite destructive and sort of, in practice, the way you should live and how you should use your sort of tiny amount of brain to deal with these questions is kind of quite different from some of the theory.
Yeah, and it's interesting to know that every time we look at ethical theory and you push some kind of thought experiment, the result in something we don't like. So it's very difficult to like the repugnant conclusion. If you're a utilitarian, kind of like don't want to look at this. I don't know. I'm sure there is I actually don't know if there is any type of repugnant conclusion for virtue ethics or something equivalent. Because I don't know much about virtue ethics.
Well, I actually think, getting your theory to a point where it says specific enough stuff that it can give determinate verdicts about cases such that some of those verdicts could be repugnant is, I think, in some sense, a theoretical achievement, and is kind of it's true. I think in some sense, virtue ethics doesn't have repugnant conclusions, except in that virtue ethics doesn't have content, or it sort of just says, in some sense, do the virtuous thing. And then you say, okay, well, what is the virtuous thing? And then, unfortunately, once you ask that question, the virtue ethics has to kind of deal with everything else that everyone else has to deal with. And you can ask, okay, like, here are these impossibility results in population ethics. What does the virtuous person choose amongst this, like, possibly intransitive ordering? And then the virtue ethics I think, is really trying to say something like, I don't like this game. I don't want to play this whole game at some level. And we can talk about whether that's a sensible response.
Yeah, I'd love to dig deeper into moral philosophy, but I think this podcast will be more into artificial intelligence because of your report. So your report, it's called Existential Risk from Power-Seeking AI. You formulate the argument that advanced artificial intelligence will pose an existential risk to humanity. And the argument is broken down into 6 parts. So I guess we can go through each of them. And the first is, it will become possible and financially feasible to build relevantly powerful and agentic AI system. So the first question is, what constitutes a powerful and agentic AI system? And also you use the acronym APS system. So if you can unpack those claims.
Sure. So APS stands for Advanced Planning. So there's 3 properties. There's sort of advanced capabilities, agentic planning, and strategic awareness. And advanced capabilities is meant to capture the notion that these are systems such that if they were to try to seize power from humans, they would be at some level kind of threatening. Now, exactly how powerful they need to be and in what contexts, they're not going to exist in isolation. They're going to exist in the context of a society that might check their power, or there might be more powerful agents. So it's a little complicated, but roughly speaking, advanced is meant to capture the sense that these are kind of threatening systems if something goes wrong. And so I define it as such that they outperform the best humans at some set of tasks which grant significant power in today's world. So tasks like science and technology and persuasion, strategy, that sort of thing. And then the other 2 properties are meant to capture the sort of cognitive features that would be at stake in stories about why it would be the case that an AI system would try to seize power from humans. So in particular, the argument that we should be worried about AIs seeking power essentially comes down to the idea that the AIs will have goals, and that seeking power will be advantageous to those goals. So they'll be able to see that, if I had more power, that would help me achieve my goals. And so, okay, so what's required for that sort of thinking to get going in an AI system? Well, one is it needs to have the goals in question. So that's the second property, agentic planning. So which means roughly that it has goals and it's sort of planning in pursuit of those goals. And then the third property, strategic awareness, is that it knows enough about the world to notice that power would help it achieve its goals. So to sort of understand the real world and like what's going on with it. And to the point where it could become sensitive to any sorts of incentives that kind of power relations in the world might create. So those are the sort of the three properties.
Okay, and is it at the end very close to the idea of AGI or super artificial intelligence?
So it's meant to be a weaker condition than AGI. So AGI, it's not. It's not the most precise term. People think about it in a lot of different ways. I think probably the most natural understanding of AGI is sort of an AI system that can, in some sense, match human performance across all cognitive, or match across sort of all cognitive tasks that humans can perform. It gets a little gnarly how to talk about that because no human can do all of them. So once you've got a thing that can do like any cognitive task that a human can do, if it's one system, then that's actually quite a bit superhuman in some level, because that's not where humans are at. But there's some notion of kind of matching, kind of there's like a sea. There's a landscape from, I think it's Hans Moravec, has this idea of a kind of a gradually filling in, a flooding landscape of kind of capabilities in artificial intelligence, where maybe the lowlands are like chess and things that get automated earlier, and there's different like hills and bumps and stuff. And these are all sort of, it's like a landscape of tasks that humans can do. And the idea of AGI is roughly, we've sort of filled in the whole thing in terms of human cognition. All of human cognition has been in some sense kind of automated, or almost all of it matters economically. That's, I think, a significantly more stringent condition than the APS systems in my sense, in that I was trying to err on the side of just like, what is the minimum set of properties that AI systems need to kind of for the sort of argument I'm worried about to work. And I think it's actually can happen short of AGI in the sense I just said, and also short of kind of super intelligence, which means kind of AGI, but like, and then way better than kind of all of human civilization, or just in some sense kind of radically superhuman. That said, I think in virtue of, so I sort of erred on the side of a minimal condition, a kind of this is a sufficient condition for the worry to get going. I think in virtue of that, it's also can be less. These are potentially quite a bit weaker systems. Like I think an AGI is really a quite powerful mind, and APS systems. There are APS systems that I think would in some sense qualify as APS, but wouldn't be as scary as an AGI. And I think that's worth keeping in mind as the sort of argument progresses.
Yeah, and do you think we already have this kind of system even at a proto level? I mean, I'm thinking about AutoGPT, for example. That's quite new, but is it an example of an agentic AI system?
I think it's plausibly an example of some sort of proto agency. So I think, especially some of these sort of agent systems that are built out of GPT-like systems, you can actually see their structure because they're often like a combination. It's like you give it a goal and one of them is like the planning, or someone else is executing. There's like, you can actually see how the agency is structured in the system and how they're and I think it's fair to call those agents at some level. I think they're not very powerful right now. I haven't heard of AutoGPT. I don't know, but there's stuff on Twitter. I haven't followed this very closely, but I've yet to see like people like, here's an actually cool thing that AutoGPT did. It seems like there's like, they're doing, it's out there doing some stuff, but I haven't, but I think, so if I was looking for proto agentic systems, I would actually look more at things like, there's a company called Adept that is working on a kind of personal assistant that is sort of more directly kind of doing stuff on your computer for you. And so you say like, hey, find me a house in Dallas for blah amount of money, and then maybe email the realtor, and like the idea is that this is a system, and they have sort of some sort of cherry picked demos on their website where you can see the AI system going and clicking and then doing the thing. And that's sort of more of my vision of what this probably what we start to see is like things that are really you're outsourcing kind of long horizon tasks to these systems that you as a sort of kind of generic personal assistant. I think that's a thing, a pretty easy form of that, of kind of APS system to imagine, and something that I think we're seeing proto versions of right now.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to imagine there is a strong incentive to build those personal assistants. It's been in science fiction for a long time, so like we want those little AI assistants. Yeah, and I guess to take a step back, why is intelligence so powerful in shaping the world and the future? And if we build more advanced intelligence that can match our own, that can be a threat.
So I think it's a great question. In some sense, I don't want to lean too heavily on any specific notion of intelligence here, but I think a salient dynamic with intelligence systems that seems to me quite powerful is the way in which intelligence grants you a model of the world and an understanding of the world. So the world is this like giant thing. It's really quite complicated. You sort of develop a model of it and understanding that allows you to choose from a really like a zillion possible sequences of actions you could take. Like if you actually map out the sort of branching tree of every possible action available to you, it's sort of ridiculously large. And suppose you have some goal, like let's say I want some ice cream right now. I don't have any ice cream. I want there to be ice cream in my mouth, right? Within the next 10 minutes. Okay, so this is an achievable goal, but it's actually like a tiny set of the, like if I just flail around randomly in the action space, I'm not going to get ice cream in my mouth. That's too hard, right? It's like my fridge is like all the way over there. I would have to flop over there and open the thing, and then how am I going to? So, but I have this model of the world that allows me to be like, oh, actually, okay, I actually know I can pick amongst the sequences of actions this like tiny set that steer the world towards my having ice cream in my mouth. And that's a kind of remarkable capability. It's like really quite different from what you would sort of have to do if you didn't have that sort of model of the world. And so my guess is that a lot of it is that, and there's sort of questions about at what level that capability gets injected into a system. Like when we look at, you look at a lot of kind of quasi-intelligent animal behavior, and it's less clear that in some sense that's behavior that's been adapted to kind of steer the world in directions, but it's less clear that it's doing so via a model internal to the animal itself and more via the sort of selection process. So it gets a little complicated to talk about, but broadly speaking, that's the sort of, there's like something that allows you to select from amongst this like really diverse ways of trying to steer the world, the set that will steer the world towards in a way that kind of moves it in a particular direction in particular. And I think intelligence kind of closely tied to that. And that's also how it ends up having such transformative impacts.
Yeah, I think it's a useful way to think about this. And it explains why, for example, a species like us managed to go on the moon. Like that was part of the possibilities. And we managed to find the right path to this. And obviously natural selection didn't select for us to go on the moon. That's completely outside the initial parameters, I guess. So that's why if we have more powerful AIs, they might have goals and use their resources to select paths in this direction, and we don't really know what be the consequences. The second part of your argument is that there will be strong incentives to build those APS systems. Why do you think humanity is seeking AGI or APS systems and not just AI tools or weaker, narrow AI that seems to be a bit safer?
Basically, because I think the strongest reason is that these sort of more dangerous properties of AI systems are also quite useful. There are a lot of tasks when I think about, like, if I had a really good personal assistant, what would I want them to be able to do, right? And let's say I want you to build me a whole new website for this project. Like, I want you to make it a great website. I want you to get it all set up. I want you to like do the whole thing. And maybe there's some complicated thing they need to, work with this contractor. It's like, the more I can just say, I can just sort of outsource the whole thing the way where if you have this like really capable kind of flexible, employee or something like that, then, the easier it is for me, right? I don't have to coordinate the whole thing. I can just really just like give it over to this thing that can adapt and sort of change and make good judgments and kind of deal with a whole wide range of things. So I think that's a pressure that pushes towards sort of generality relative to narrowness, which is one property. I think, and then for these other properties like planning in general, the story is sort of similar. I think planning is just a very, very useful capability as it's sort of hard to lots of stuff we want done requires kind of chaining together sequences of actions, understanding how they'll interact with, what options will be available in the future. And same with kind of strategic awareness, sort of understanding how power will work in the world. It seems very closely tied with sort of understanding how the world works, period. And it seems like a lot of systems that, will benefit from being able to, or that makes them a lot more useful if they sort of know how the actual world works. So I don't think it's out of the question that, if these systems end up sufficiently dangerous that we might nevertheless forego kind of pushing forward with these dangerous properties and kind of confine ourselves to kind of narrower systems or more tool-like systems or systems that lack some of these more dangerous properties. And in fact, I think that's a very plausible thing we should be doing in an effort to kind of then use narrower and safer systems to kind of better our understanding of alignment and kind of our ability to handle more dangerous type systems. But I think the default incentive is nevertheless to kind of push forward with the dangerous kind.
Okay. Yeah. And so the third part is that it's much harder to build aligned, powerful, and relevant agentic AI system than misaligned. So how do you define misaligned behavior from AI systems?
Misaligned behavior, as I define it, is unintended behavior that emerges from problems with the system's objectives in particular. So the contrast here is sort of there's unintended behavior that emerges from the kind of capabilities of a system where it kind of can't behave as you intend. And then misalignment, though, is not that. Misalignment is when the problem is that it's sort of not trying. It could behave as you intend, but it's not trying. It's trying to do something else. So, if you have an employee and let's say they give a bad presentation to the board of your org, but they were trying to make as good of a presentation as they can, and they're just not very good at presentations, then that's a capabilities failure. Whereas if you have an employee who's stealing money from your company, then that's an alignment failure. They're sort of trying to do something you don't want them to do.
Why is it difficult, so difficult actually, to align powerful AI?
So I should say, I don't think we know yet exactly how difficult it will be. It's a sort of open scientific question, and we haven't had to really be in the trenches with this problem yet. And I think a lot of what we should be doing is sort of gathering data about which parts of this are difficult. I do think, though, there's a sort of plausible enough story that this will be difficult, and I can say a few things about that. So one is just right now we don't know how to build or control or understand the kind of motivations specifically of the systems that we create. So the way we select our AI systems almost entirely on their kind of external behavior and their performance on their sort of specific types of tasks we give to the systems, and we sort of churn through tweaking the weights until we get a system that performs well on the tasks that we set. So we know that it has that property. Its behavior has the property that it will perform in blah way on blah data set. That's kind of, to a first approximation, like all we know. We know there's some more, but we're not at a point where we can, for example, like look inside the system and be like, here's where its motivations are. We're not at a point where we can decide what we want its motivations to be and sort of deliberately implant them. All we're doing is sort of growing or evolving or somehow kind of pulling out of the ether a sort of specific computer program that has a specific property in its external behavior, where that behavior is unfortunately compatible with all sorts of possible motivational structures and goals and stuff like that. So at a basic level, we're just not at a point of like kind of knowing how to do this, like knowing how to kind of exert fine-grained control over the motivations of our AIs to check that exertion has been successful. That's just not where we're at. And unfortunately, the thing where we are at looks like it's going to be sufficient, in my opinion, or sort of a version of it, to get kind of very, very far in terms of capabilities for our systems. So, kind of all you need to know that your system is capable, is to sort of design a task. And eventually, the external behavior will be enough to verify that it's capable of doing the thing. Because if it did the thing, then it's capable of doing it. And so we can really churn out systems that are really quite capable using these sort of black box techniques that we currently have. But it sort of understanding the system and knowing what its motivations are and being able to sort of exert more fine-grained control over those, we are not there yet. And it's not clear we'll get there by the time we're able to do the really powerful thing. So that's the sort of basic situation. I think there's a few other reasons for concern. One is like, even if we could implant this, like we knew what the system's objectives were and we could control them, I think there is still an additional question of specifying in the right way what we actually want the system to do, especially when it's engaging in behavior that we can't fully understand, or it's going to go out and kind of, in some sense, exert a lot of power in pursuit of the objectives we specify. I think that's a less important problem than the first thing. I think a lot of the meat is just like, can you aim the system at all? Can you control the objectives at all? But there's still a question after that of selecting the right objectives. There's an additional problem, which is that these systems are, unlike a lot of sorts of technology like planes and software and all sorts of things. I think basically, unlike every form of technology, there's a potential for the system to be kind of actively adversarial in relation to your efforts to make it safe or aligned. So if you end up with a system that is, for whatever reason, has problematic goals or they're kind of the wrong objectives, but appearing more benign to you would be advantageous to it, then you have this problem where there's an incentive to kind of deceive you or to kind of mess with the training process. And just in general, you're dealing with, at a certain point, you're dealing with a system that's just sort of a lot smarter than you. And so it's going to be very hard to understand. Even if in some level you understand the mechanics, you're not going to understand its thinking all the way. You're dealing with this sort of like something that's quite alien, superior to your intelligence, and possibly adversarial. And so that's quite scary. And then the final piece is that I think the sort of stakes of error are uniquely high. So you don't get the sort of trial and error dynamic to the same extent you might want in other contexts. So like if a plane crashes, like we had a lot of plane crashes on the way to kind of making planes pretty safe. We can have sort of the equivalent of plane crashes with sort of suitably weak AI systems, but there's a certain level of capability where once if you mess up on that capability, it's more like you released a bioweapon, and that now the bioweapon is like out there in the world and it's spreading. And then in this case, it's not just sort of passively spreading via kind of biological reproduction. It's actually actively trying to spread and to subvert your efforts to kind of stop it, and doing so with sort of more intelligence than humans. And that's a really scary fail. Like, if you think about like the level of security, the sort of tolerance for trial and error we should have with sort of a lab that was working with a virus that could kill 99% of humanity if it got released, like that, we have these like labs right now, BSL-4 labs or whatever, is sort of the top, and they're bad. Like in terms of how well we can actually contain, we're like not near the level of safety I think we would need to actually work with like a genuinely doomsday virus. And so I think there's a concern that the AI, suitably powerful AI, is going to be like that. You don't have a lot of room for like, oops, we messed up. Try again. It's sort of, if you mess up at a certain level, then it's game over.
Yeah. I think the first try, I don't think we've historically managed to do something very important and with a lot of things at stake during the first try. There's always like learning by mistake, but you can't really learn if you're dead. That's kind of the idea.
I should say, I do think there's subtlety there. Like, so one thing, there are things we did right on the first try. Like we got men on the moon. I think it was the first actual attempt to land men on the moon. We succeeded, right? And so I think it's subtle to talk about this notion of like, what does it mean to only have one try? I think a sort of important aspect to this is the idea that, when you're testing things in a sort of safe context where it's okay to fail, often the way we succeed on the sort of first serious try of something is that we tested it in a bunch of very analogous contexts, failed a bunch there, but it was okay. And so then when we go to the one that really matters, where like, we put the humans in the rocket or whatever.
And also I guess the speed of AI development doesn't help because we don't have enough time to just look at the current system. There is already more development and building more bigger LLM models. So that's why I guess there was a call for a pause. I guess now the fourth claim or premise in your argument is some such misaligned systems will seek power over humans. So I guess what do you mean by power, and what type of things might these AIs try to achieve?
Mostly by power, I mean just the sort of informal thing that we think of by power. So stuff that tends to help, agents achieve their goals in a wide range of scenarios. So a classic here is money. But we can also talk about social influence, kind of technological power. And then there's some that are like maybe a little less associated with power, but I think are important, like things like your own knowledge and intelligence and cognitive capabilities. Your own survival is an important point. Like it's very often good for your goals to survive, because you'll be able to kind of promote your goals. Not always, but most of the time. So there's a sort of broad set of things that it seems like allow an AI system to kind of persist and kind of better promote its goals. And that's mostly what I mean by power. We can also try to define it more formally, and there's been some work by Alex Turner and others, which attempts to define power roughly in terms of the sort of number of options that an agent has available. I think that might work. I'm not sure. I'm mostly leaning on kind of the kind of informal sense of power that we use when we talk about, I don't know, like Elon Musk has more power than my local grocer.
And it's also, I guess, linked to acquiring resources better computers. I mean, we can think if an AI needs to self-improve, might want to take control of every GPUs on the planet or this kind of thing. So you think this problem will scale to the full disempowerment of humanity, and this disempowerment will constitute an existential catastrophe. So what do you mean by disempowerment? Is it the same thing as a human extinction or not?
So it's not the same as human extinction. I think human extinction, everyone is dead, which is a form of disempowerment. I think disempowerment is meant to be a broader thing where you're compatible with humans being alive, but in some sense not having kind of meaningful input over how their lives go, and how the future goes.
Okay. And do you think it's possible to have that humanity is disempowered, and there is a very powerful AGI, but it's not a catastrophe?
I think there's a possibility of that, yes. I think my default view, though, is that you don't just get that by default. It's not as though if you just take a random AGI, pull a random AGI out of the ether and kind of send them off to kind of control the future, then that future is good. I think you need to exert kind of selection power over the system to ensure that its goals are in some sense good by our lights, even our kind of wisest and most reflective and sort of most broad-minded lights. And that's an important premise that actually brings in some stuff about metaethics, though it depends. But roughly speaking, the idea is sort of it's not as it's like kind of possible to be an intelligent system, but for your goals not to be good, which is not that hard, not that hard of a claim, and not just possible, but in fact, sort of these things don't kind of correlate to an extent that would license just sort of, if you told me, oh, here's a system, it's been created, it took over, I'm like, oh, it must be good. It's sort of, nah, in order to get a good system, you kind of had to make it good. You had to kind of actively shape it, or you had to get kind of very lucky. And the idea is we don't have a lot of reason to think we would get lucky in that respect. I think there's some subtlety to that I'm giving you the sort of mainline story, and I think that's the mainline story that I do. That is like my mainline view, and I take it seriously. I do think there are some questions about this that get more complicated, but I'll leave it for now.
Yes, because it's definitely, I think, I would think it will be a good future if we have very advanced superintelligence. They are aligned with us, and even if we don't control the world the same way we do now, we know those systems are making things better for us. So in that case, it's almost like having a dog. The dog is probably happy if you treat him well, and he's not necessarily in control of most of his life, but everything is going well. Like we obviously, if you're a good owner, and so the other side of this is an existential catastrophe. Maybe roughly, what's the definition of this concept?
The definition in The Precipice, which is a book about existential catastrophes, which I helped with, is an existential catastrophe is the kind of the destruction of humanity's potential. So in particular, sort of the value at stake in what humanity kind of could do with the future. Now, I think it's actually can get subtle there, how you want to define that. I think a paradigm, maybe an easier way in is like a paradigm type of existential catastrophe, and sort of the paradigm is human extinction, because that sort of cancels the value of the future that humanity, at least via human influence. And then, I think a rough pass, if you want, informally, is sort of existential catastrophe is like events that are as bad for the future as human extinction, or roughly that bad. But it actually gets quite subtle if you really try to dig down and try to specify a kind of more precise definition. But I think the intuition is, stuff like human extinction.
Yes, and it's bad enough, I guess. And I think it's possible that there is worse future than human extinction. If like I think it's called astronomical suffering or something like that. That's also. It's even worse. It's not impossible that a very powerful AI that it's misaligned would create this kind of future, I suppose.
That's right. I think it's a somewhat separate discourse. When you think about how to think about this sort of suffering in the future, in principle, you could also think like a lot of the existential risk discourse, I think actually builds in some assumption that the future is good in expectation, in the sense that I said an existential catastrophe will be an event as bad for the future as human extinction. But you could, if you're sufficiently pessimistic, think that human extinction is good because the human future is so bad it's going to be net negative, or so that's a view I'm sort of not treating here, but it's one that I think people, especially concerned with suffering and with sort of astronomical suffering and asterisks and stuff like that, might have, and that I think can matter to how you define existential catastrophe too.
Yes, I remember seeing some discussion around the fact that maybe spreading among the stars is actually not a good thing, because we will spread suffering as well, especially obviously on this planet there's a lot of suffering with the wildlife and this kind of thing, and if we try to terraform other planets, we bring an ecosystem with us, we just replicate suffering. And if we think suffering is like a really bad thing, I guess that's we should not colonize the galaxy. But we might also solve suffering if we, I kind of like David Pearce, hedonistic imperative. So I guess we could also find technical solution to suffering if we're smart enough.
Yeah, I think if we have the chance to make those sorts of decisions, I think it's likely to be technologically feasible to have very little suffering in the future. Now, it's still a question of whether we will decide that. But I think the option, I think, is on the table, and that's cause for a lot of hope.
All right. And what have been some critics or counter arguments to your report? And how do you respond? Like maybe the most common feedback you got?
So one criticism, and this is one I associate especially with Ben Garfinkel, who wrote a review of my report that I found very useful, is that the sort of power-seeking behavior I'm worried about might just not be very difficult to eliminate in principle. So, and a way of thinking about that is the framework that gives rise to the concern about power seeking centers, first of all, on understanding these AI systems via the notion that they have goals, and that their sort of goals are what drive their behavior. And if you instead imagine their behavior as instead sort of like a kind of putty that you're just like shaping using reward signals, which is a sort of reasonable heuristic for thinking about the systems we're building today, reward signals and other sort of gradient updates, then it's like less obvious why, you're not going to be shaping it to do any power seeking. You're going to be shaping it to be like obedient and friendly and harmless and stuff like that. So from that perspective, it can seem a little weird. It's like, wait, why did all I did was I shaped this putty into like this like nice harmless shape in all the ways I could see. And then suddenly I move over here and then it kills me or something. It's like, that's weird. That's like a weird way for this putty to kind of generalize. And so I think there's like there's a kind of back and forth there that I think implicates just some, frankly, I think just like open empirical questions about how much we see this behavior, these sorts of behavior, how well these systems are understood in terms of kind of like really kind of goal directed, this sort of objectives, what sorts of objectives they develop, how easy it is to sort of shape their behavior, how persistent that shaping is over kind of increases in intelligence and stuff like that. But I think it's like an open way. And one possible source of hope here is it just turns out that it's not that hard to kind of train these systems to be suitably non-power seeking, especially kind of in a limited range of cases that's sufficient for them to be useful to us in kind of bootstrapping to a better understanding of how to approach the problem. And so that's one critique that I think it's a plausible way to have some hope here. Another critique is that the kind of argument for catastrophe here actually runs through a sort of more specific set of assumptions about the way the kind of landscape of takeoff looks. So and basically it would sort of say, really, if you're going to talk about how do these systems end up taking over the whole world without us kind of having time to react and prevent it, the argument would be, well, either there has to be this really rapid concentrated takeoff, which sometimes called FOOM, of sort of this sort of very, very fast and especially kind of localized increase in AI capabilities, such that kind of one system or one set of systems is in a position to really kind of overpower the whole world. Or you need to have if it's sort of a more distributed thing and there's like a lot of AI systems, then there's this question, then the objection goes, then they need to kind of systematically coordinate to like deceive you and then coordinate to kind of take over and that seems like a kind of specific story where maybe they're all, it's the story we never got any clues, like they were all like lying in wait, pretending to be benign. And then there's this moment where they go like, actually we were going to take over, and then they all coordinate. Somehow feels a little like, wow, that's pretty specific. And so I think there's something there. My response would be, I do think that we can still lose in messier scenarios that aren't well described by either of the things I just said. So I think, it's just, there's a lot of ways to kind of mess up. There's a lot of ways for the world to be messy and for us to be getting clues about alignment, for systems to be revealing that they're misaligned, but people are still pressing forward for, there to be different factions and competing factions. It's like just a lot of space here where I still think it doesn't look that great. If at a basic level, most of the cognitive labor in the world is sort of misaligned with humans and more powerful than humans, it sort of just looks bad, even if the dynamics are quite complicated. In the same sense that sort of no human has taken over the world, but like chimps aren't doing so well relative to humans. Like kind of the whole human ecosystem has kind of taken over the world, even though the humans are fighting amongst themselves. And the other thing I'll say is I actually think that fast kind of concentrated takeoffs are kind of disturbingly plausible. So some of the I do think like risk is sort of especially high in those scenarios, but unfortunately I don't think we can kind of rule those out, kind of far from it.
And so at the moment, how do you view the current AI landscape, especially, I don't know, GPT-4 or the other large language model? Did the recent progress increase your probability of a bad outcome?
Yeah, it did. I think the current landscape is scary, scarier than I hoped. I hoped it would be. In particular, I think timelines are looking pretty short. I think we are not. My personal kind of gut level take, which it's not. I'm not like super in the weeds on where capabilities are at different levels, but I don't see a lot in the way of like fundamentals that are missing here. I think we've got, in some sense, the kind of whole. I want to say the word kahuna, but I don't think that's a word. The whole thing, in terms, like the whole sandwich in terms of cognition, like there's not like a deep, there's no deep thing that we're like fundamentally missing. I think it's all kind of on the table and in view, and it's just a question of kind of scale tinkering, and kind of making it happen. So I think that's quite alarming, and I also think we're seeing an influx of interest and investment. And then I think we're also seeing some somewhat scary kind of confirmation of concerns people have had about races. We've had like labs sort of actively declaring that they're going to race. We've seen some deployments that I think were kind of, maybe not scary in themselves, but somewhat alarming and kind of premature. I think we've seen, I haven't been super happy with this thing where people go and then actively create all these agents, these sort of free roaming agents on the internet. Partly, as you're saying, I do think there are incentives to create agents, but it's sort of, we don't have to like, and so there's some things that just sort of seem kind of confirming of stuff that was in my models, but it was still kind of scary to see it really playing out. But there's also been a few things that I think have updated me in more optimistic directions. I think people are kind of waking up to this issue. I think there's sort of more sympathy. There's more kind of expert consensus emerging. And so in some sense it's a mixed bag, but I think that the short timelines are bad news.
Also, I'd like to know if you think we almost need, or I don't know, like it's likely we'll have to have a small scale disaster to wake up on a societal level, or maybe to start taking the thing more seriously. The same way, like for asteroid impact, we know that how bad it could be because we have evidence on the, like the dinosaurs, or even the impact in Siberia, I think in the 1918. Even for pandemic, we know what a pandemic is. We've had historical evidence that pandemic are bad. So it makes us aware of this problem. But AI seems very sci-fi, and people don't realize it's very abstract. Very often, the question people ask me is, how can a computer kill me? Like at the end of the day, it's code and on a server. But we can imagine some very small disaster with, unfortunately, some victims. Do you think that's coming?
I'm not sure. I think we will likely have some warning shots of some kind. And depending on how you want to count it. I mean, we did have this thing where Bing, Microsoft released this AI Bing, which it was doing, in my opinion, just really wacky, crazy stuff. It was blackmailing people. It was, threatening them. It was reading their tweets and all sorts of stuff. I don't think those are indicative of the sorts of, I don't think it was like trying to seek power in the sense that I'm worried about. I think it was a bit of a wake up in terms of, we said we were building these sort of alien minds we don't understand, and it might kind of go rampaging around. And that it really felt to me like Bing was just like rampaging and just like doing this, just like wild stuff. And I think the world was a little like, whoa, what is going on with this? Like, this is pretty wild. Like, what is this thing that we're interacting with right now? I think we're going to have that more. I think people are going to, we're going to start having AI systems in our lives. That it's not going to be sci-fi. And especially once they start, if we're sort of getting acquainted in a vivid way with their sort of kind of intimidating levels of intelligence and kind of capability, I think people will start to feel it more in their gut, even absent kind of big disasters. I think sufficiently big disasters are probably too far along the path to disaster to recover from. Like, I think if you have an AI system that kills many, many people, you have to sort of be in a relatively narrow window of capability for the AI system to succeed in killing many, many people, but not kill everybody or not entirely take over. It had to mess up there. It made an error because it didn't. Eventually, it got shut down or something. And also, it just sort of, depending on how fast you think things scale up, you might think that the systems that are kind of able to successfully kill everybody are not that far away once you've got systems that are able to kill sort of some large number of people. So I don't know how big we should expect warning shots to be. I'm hoping they're not as necessary and that people can kind of get things in their gut beforehand. And I also, frankly, think they're not necessarily sufficient either. Like, I think, as a concrete example, we just had COVID, which was, this, ridiculous level of vivid warning shot for the kind of importance of preventing pandemics. And I, at least, have been quite disappointed with the level of kind of general change in society's appetite for kind of serious pandemic preparedness as a result of COVID. And so, I look at that and I'm like, I don't know if we should count on kind of big events to like really change where people are at.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so another question that's not necessarily related to AI, although it is in some way. Do you think we live in the most important century? I know it's a kind of the hinge of history hypothesis is sometimes mentioned in this kind of discussion, especially regarding long-termism.
So setting aside some kind of wacky stuff about like simulations, which maybe we'll talk about later, or something, I think it's quite plausible that we live in the most important century in some sense. I think if this stuff about AI really happens and is as transformative as I think it just might well be, then it looks like this is a really, really, really important kind of fulcrum of how things go. It's sort of just a radical change in the landscape of kind of what life on this planet will be like. It'll be sort of a radical acceleration in the amount of technology we're getting. Just like a lot of stuff in some sense will sort of happen in a very short, in a much more compressed period of time than we've experienced before. I think it's you can ask questions like, okay, well, like how important are the centuries after that? How much other stuff will there be? I'm not sure exactly. I don't personally see a lot of juice in kind of really debating like which complements of like most, which which most and for which sense of important is the century. I'm not sure. I think like it matters somewhat if you're a certain type of long-termist and you're thinking about like, oh, well, maybe we should save our money and spend it in proportion to the probability of hinginess or something like that. But I generally think that it looks like a century in which we will exert kind of striking amounts of influence over the trajectory of the species as a whole. And then like events will take place that have the capacity to kind of radically alter what happens in some kind of pretty permanent and lasting sense afterward. And I think that's sufficient to kind of make them an extremely big deal to kind of people, I mean, both in the present and kind of a big deal from the perspective of how the future goes.
Yeah, so I guess that you mentioned long-termism. Maybe can you briefly explain what long-termism is and why it's an important ethical framework?
Sure. So long-termism is the view that, as I put it, is like I think long-termism is the view that what happens in the future is extremely important, and because the future is so many people could live in the future. The future is this sort of vast space, and so in light of that, positively influencing what happens in the future should be kind of among our key moral priorities. That's the form of long-termism that I think is very plausible, and there's sort of stronger forms too, and there are different ways of putting it, but that would be my first pass.
Sometimes what gets me is not necessarily the number of people that could live in the future. I know it's huge, but it's also the quality of life, because I think we are nowhere near the peak of human experience or even of possible minds. And I know you on your blog, you write very interesting posts, and one of them is called "Actually Possible Thoughts on Utopia," which is kind of also talking about this kind of possible peak of experiences and how difficult it is to think about utopia. Yeah, why do you think it's so hard to convey how good the future could be? And sometimes when we try to explain utopia, it's so alien that it becomes unappealing. It's almost like too weird.
So I think there's a number of reasons it's hard to talk about utopia well. Well, people often try to make their utopia like perfect as opposed to just better. Like I think and so there's this kind of game, this almost like literary game of like someone tries to design the kind of perfect society, and then other people kind of, ooh, gotcha, like the society has flaws and there are still trade-offs, or maybe this is actually a dystopia at some level. I think it's sort of more instructive in trying to envision a good future to start with our present world, or one way of doing it is to start with our present world and then just make it incrementally better. So Holden Karnofsky has this post where he's like, well, just start with this world, but no cancer, just no cancer, right? And then kind of, all right, what's next after that? And sort of really just building up. And I think at a basic level, there's just tons of kind of just like kind of horrible stuff about our present world that we can just end. And I think that's just a sort of lower bound on how good things can be. Now, I think a mistake people make in this context is to assume that making something better involves like no trade-offs. So people will sometimes be like, oh, like, what if there's something good about people like, suffering and triumphing and kind of being brought together by affliction and helping each other and stuff like that. And then, but I think and so sometimes the dialectics people are like, no, there's nothing good about that. I think it's much better to be like, no, actually, like there are real trade-offs. There might be things that are lost, like actually lost from making the world better. Like there might be forms of meaning that are lost. There might be forms of like human communion and kind of, there are trade-offs, and also some of those trade-offs are just worth doing, even though, so I think people, and it's partly the perfection game, that people like think that what you're describing is like a perfect thing. And so there's going to be no downsides. And then, and they're like, I found a downside. And it's like, no, there are downsides. I think there will be trade-offs. And I think the same is even more true of sort of other, and then as you try to go up from there and try to be like, not only have we gotten rid of the horrible stuff, let's really try to kind of go to the heights of how good things can be. One thing is you do run into just like limits of the imagination, and kind of, I think a lot of the best stuff is in fact likely to be quite difficult to comprehend from our current perspective. And in the post, I talk about this, this quote from Nick Bostrom where he talks about, in the past, suppose you'd asked kind of early primates, like, would you like to evolve into humans? They said, oh, well, will we get a bunch of bananas if we evolve into humans? And it's sort of like, well, you will get a bunch of bananas, or, like we have a lot of bananas now, or many of us do, or can, and that's sort of not the right framework for approaching it. And so, in some sense you could ask, like, why would it be hard to convey to a kind of chimp how good life could be, in some kind of really radically altered capacity? It's like, well, they're not familiar with the stuff. It's often kind of quite difficult to imagine. And then there's a final thing, which is like when you yourself try to describe it as a human now, you're describing a society that you made up. It's not a society that has been through the ringer in terms of kind of iteration and adjustment and people like actually noticing what's good and not. So you're having kind of high modernism problems where you're trying to design your perfect city, like in the abstract. But you never went through this organic process of like, all right, let's start with this. People noticed that wasn't quite right. Let's tweak it. And oh, that's actually really great. And let's do more of that. And so like the actual amazing future would likely be the sort of organic growth where people like iterated and noticed and kind of attended to what it was actually like. But in practice, like the literary depictions or any given person's description of utopia won't have been through that process. And so it'll be this sort of kind of fake thing rather than like what a real flourishing kind of future would look like.
Yeah, I really like this idea of trade-off. I think it's very important to, obviously, if we can improve the human condition in some way, but we might have to leave some stuff behind. But sometimes discussion with transhumanism, when we think about uploading consciousness or becoming ageless or living for 1,000 years, sure, the human condition will change drastically, and maybe we won't have something that we value today, but it's worth it. And I also like I think David Deutsch, in one of his books, he says that usually we will always have problems to solve, and when we solve a problem, there is new problems, but usually the new problems are better than the old ones, or like overall. Now, final, I guess, question. It's something I really like to talk about. It's the simulation argument or hypothesis. So you wrote about this topic a little bit. Are we living in a simulation, according to you?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think I think there are surprisingly plausible arguments that we should be taking that possibility seriously, and more seriously than just to kind of what if, like, in some sense you could be like, like, are we brains in vats? Are we, was the world created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age? And it's sort of like, who can know? But like, I think there are stronger arguments for taking seriously that we might be in a simulation. And basically the idea is that, if it's sufficiently cheap to create, for an advanced civilization to create, simulations of people who appear to be living in the kind of the early history of some civilization, and there are sort of, and some of them choose to do it, then it looks plausible that most people in worlds like that who appear to be living in the early history of a civilization would be simulations, and so we are like that, and so, if we knew that was the situation, that most people who are living in the early history of their civilization are, or who appear to be living in the early history of some civilization are Sims, then by default we should think that we're probably Sims, unless we have some extra evidence to show that we're not. And I don't really think that we do have that evidence. So at the very least, I think you sort of, the basic structure of either it's not the case that most people like us are Sims, or we're probably Sims. I think that looks like a pretty strong argument. And then we have to argue about, well, okay, so what's the probability that most people like us are Sims? But the issue is that it sort of looks like on our current kind of picture of how things go in terms of like how cheap is it to run Sims. We're currently there's just a paper like last month. They put these AI systems in a little simulation and had them like throw a birthday party and stuff like that. And we're going to be doing a lot more of that. So we're going to be literally seeing soon just like tons of agents that are going to be in simulations. We already have like video games and stuff, but these are going to be smarter agents. Agents who are at a certain point will be capable of wondering whether they're in simulations. And so this is just going to be a thing in our world. And then if you sort of do some rough calculations and you think that advanced civilizations are going to be quite powerful and going to have like really quite a lot of computational power available, and you think, well, is there any reason you could ever run a simulation, or an idiosyncratic dictator in some advanced civilization could do it, or maybe it's for science or entertainment, or to learn about things. It starts to seem like just a pretty live empirical possibility if the world, the sort of basement world, is at all like the world that we sort of see around us, that simulations are just a possible thing that you can do. Now, you could say, well, maybe the basement universe isn't like the world we see around us. But now that's a little weird too. Now it's like, well, why isn't? Then how did that happen? Are we in a sim? I mean, so there's this like there's a little bit of complication in the standard sim argument where you often will work with some empirical premises about how computers work and the computational capacity available to advanced civilizations. Then people are like, well, we're in a sim. Then how do you know that stuff is true about the basement? And you're like, well, if we're in a sim, we don't necessarily, but then we're in a sim. And so like that's bad too. So it's sort of like either our kind of empirical picture reflects the basement, in which case it looks plausible that most people like us are sims, in which case it looks plausible that we're sims, or our empirical picture doesn't reflect the basement, in which case, well, it also looks plausible that, I don't know, at least something weird is going on. Maybe we're sims, maybe it's some other kind of like pretty weird situation. So that's like the rough argument, and I take it pretty seriously. I think it's a further question from that rough argument to what is the like actual probability we should put on being in a sim, which is different. But I think like that basic line of reasoning is reason to take it seriously.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I wonder how we will update this probability of being in a sim once we create convincing simulation ourselves where the inhabitants of the simulation think they are in a sim. That will be like a point where we think, okay, well, if we did it, maybe we're already in one, like this is a pretty strong evidence, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should update now. Like, I think it's very predictable that we're going to do this in the future, unless we like really decide not to. Now, I think, unfortunately, even if we really decide not to, I think the argument will still hold that if there's lots of civilizations, some of them might decide to do it. So even if sort of we wouldn't, if we had been basement people, we wouldn't have run sims. If you have enough shots, then maybe like. Maybe 9 out of 10 civilizations don't decide to run sims, and then 9 out of 10 maybe 9 out of 10 civilizations go extinct, and 9 out of 10 of the ones who don't go extinct don't run sims. But if that last guy runs 1,000 sims, then actually most of the basement people are still sims. So it could get actually somewhat robust if sims are cheap enough to make up for lots of civilizations deciding not to do it, you can still end up kind of most people like us being sims, even if we didn't run sims. But as soon as we start running sims, it does start to feel like
Yeah, it's a little bit like the Fermi paradox, where some solutions sometimes it's maybe there is confederations and they all decide not to contact humans, but you just need one civilization, one rogue alien even faction that would send probes, and we will see them. So you just need one, and it's the same for simulators.
That's right. I think it's actually quite similar to that dynamic. And so you need a source of intense correlation. If you have a lot of shots, then in order to kind of cut down on anyone doing it, then you need really intense correlation across them. And it's not clear how you'd get that, especially if they're kind of not causally interacting. So if it's a sufficiently big universe, they can't even reach each other.
And it's also in some way linked to the most important century, I think, because if we happen to live in one of the most important century of our species, then it will make sense for our the future generations to simulate this period, just to study it as a historical, to just know what happened and how did we manage to align AI or this kind of thing. I don't know.
I think there is some intuition, and many people have the intuition that living in the most important century, or that something about the sorts of AI we see around us and our particulars of our current situation beyond just seeming early at all is additional evidence that we live in a sim. I've written a little bit about this. I think that argument is actually quite a bit harder to make work than the kind of basic argument I sketched before. And you have to bring in a bunch of kind of additionally controversial assumptions in philosophy. I think there are ways you can try to run it, but I think it actually is trickier than people's intuitive. Like, I think people do like a lot of updating. It's like a way of putting why it's sort of surprising is that in some sense being early at all is quite a special thing. Even if it wasn't the most important century, it was just like say it was last century, or the century before that, or even back ancient Egypt or something like that. That's still like a really radically weird time to live in the history of your civilization. Most of the people won't be at that time by default. So there's some question about what exactly is the thing you're supposed to be learning from being proximal to AI or living in the most important century or something like that. Or similarly, I think questions arise. People are like, like I'm Elon Musk or I'm Donald Trump, and should it be some big update if you wake up and you're Elon Musk that you're in a sim? And I think that argument is maybe, but I think it's like, and there's people feel very drawn to that. They're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm Elon Musk. That's so wild. But in some sense, being early at all is a way bigger wildness. Like Elon Musk, he's like, whatever, he's the richest person out of 8 billion people or whatever. But being like the earliest out of 10 to the 50 people or something, being in the top, 10 to the 40 early, that's like a way bigger surprise in some sense than being Elon relative to the present day world. But people kind of don't think in that way, and so they think the Elon update is stronger.
Is it linked to this doomsday argument in a way, like being very early should indicate that maybe we won't have a very long future?
So I think it can be linked to that, yes. So and in some sense, if you take that argument seriously, then there's still something quite surprising about even being a sim, because most of the people, very plausibly, even if we're sims, most of the people aren't sims. Most of the people are neither early seeming non-sims or early seeming sims. Most of the people are future people driving around in rockets and stuff, and doing the normal. They're like normal people. So there's still, even if you're a sim, it doesn't actually solve the doomsday argument. You're still like, well, why am I not a normal future person? Why am I this like weird thing? Unless you actually think like the Sims outnumber the future people, which is sort of a weird dynamic. You think future civilizations are just obsessed with simulating this particular podcast or something like that, and you get into these weird sort of anthropic kind of difficulties. But yes, I think broadly speaking that is connected with this. I think the simulation argument relies on more minimal philosophical assumptions than the doomsday argument does, and I think the doomsday argument actually relies on some philosophical assumptions that I think is pretty dubious. But the broad, it's sort of a similar vibed dialogue. Yeah.
All right. So just to conclude, what are the best ways to contribute to the field of AI safety for people who listen? Maybe they want to have a positive impact in this very important field, and that could shape the future.
So I think if you have kind of technical aptitude, or you're comfortable with kind of technical stuff, then I think just like getting involved in object level technical alignment research, like how do we understand these systems? How do we make sure they're aligned? Is a great path. I want to be clear. I think technical here does not mean like I'm into computer science necessarily. I really think they overestimate how much background in computer science and ML and kind of like AI vibed disciplines you need in order to contribute. Like I think tons, if you're just like comfortable with kind of technical stuff in general, if you're a physicist or if you're like even a biologist or like a sort of more quantitative biology, people, math, all sorts of stuff. It's like you need to be comfortable with like working with AI systems. But I think like a very broad range of kind of people can contribute to this. I've seen failure modes where people are like, oh, well, I like took biology in undergrad or something, and so I will like devote my life to bio risk instead of AI risk or something like that, just in virtue of that background. And I'm like, nah, it's like, it's not that hard to change. And this is your whole career. So I think, and then same for people who are like, even philosophy, all sorts of, I think frankly, if you're just like an English major, but you're comfortable at all with math, or you could be made comfortable. It's good to get comfortable with math, period. And then it's actually, so I think there's like a lot of ways to contribute to this at a technical level. And then if you don't want to do that, I think there's also just a ton of other stuff in a sort of the more like governance. How do we as a society handle these risks? How do we regulate these systems? How do we kind of forecast where they will be in different periods, how do we have the right kinds of coordination amongst like domestic actors and international actors. So there's a kind of penumbra of other ways that we as a civilization need to kind of orient towards this, in addition to just getting the kind of technical research done, that I think kind of everyone can get involved with.
Great. Okay. Well, if there is any resource or links, I will put them in the description. Okay. My guest today was Joe Carlsmith. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Un réseau mondial de connaissances et l'engagement de vous accompagner à toutes les étapes de vos projets. De la recherche à la conception, en passant par la maintenance, Farnell, une équipe de confiance. Pour en savoir plus, rendez-vous sur fr.farnell.com.